Hi, my name's Charles, and recently I've been asking myself the question, is Memory of Chaos getting harder over time? And, if you've been paying any attention to YouTube creators, if you've been on any kind of Honkai Star Rail social media, or if you just clicked on this thumbnail to get mad, obviously you're going to be saying right now, well, of course it's getting harder. We can look at the hit points of the enemies. We can see that they're going up over time. And, obviously it's getting harder. But my question is, does that actually translate it to it being harder for players? How do we measure the actual difficulty of something like Memory of Chaos in the context of the whole game? And so I sort of jumped into my little stats engine to try to work this out. And the first hypothesis I came up with had to do with stars. Every stage of Memory of Chaos gives you up to 3 stars. You get 3 stars if you clear it perfectly. You lose 1 star if any of your characters die. You lose another star if you have fewer than 20 cycles remaining. And you lose another star if you have fewer than 10 cycles remaining. And so this is a pretty good measure of the actual difficulty of a stage in Honkai Star Rail is how many people get a certain number of stars. You'd expect if the difficulty is increasing over time, then the number of people getting 3 stars is going to be going down, and those people who used to get 3 stars will shift down to 2 stars, people who used to get 2 stars will shift down to 1 stars, and so on. And so what I did was I grabbed the data sets for Memory of Chaos that Pridewin used, going all the way back to version 2.2 of the game. I could have gone back earlier, but the format of the dataset changes beyond that, and it was just a bit too much effort for me to change my parser to accept both. So answer to that, why I stopped at 2.2 is I'm lazy, but it turns out that 2.2 to 3.0 gives me a pretty good set of statistics. So let's look at how people were actually doing in Memory of Chaos from 2.2 to 3.0. So let's start with floor 10. Floor 10, so this is just a stacked graph. I've zoomed in right at the bottom because otherwise we're not going to see any detail. So these are only the bottom couple of % of people, and these top one is, these are the people who 3-starred, 2-starred, 1-starred, and 0-starred is the lightest color that you can barely see any of. And you can see for floor 10, it's remained consistently pretty easy throughout all these versions. Fewer than 1% of the people in the statistics are not 3-starring floor 10. You can see 2.2 is actually sort of comparatively difficult, and then 2.3, 4, 5, 6, 7, almost nobody fails floor 10. 3.0, bit of a jump up, but a lot of this could be, it's so low that it could be statistical noise. And I think something that's worth saying about the Pridewin statistics, right, is the way that they're gathered is 50% of the samples are people who gave their profiles to the people who are collecting the data, and they sort of logged in and registered to have their data collected. And about the other 50% of the samples are people who are just randomly spidered through the API. And the statistics are made up of all the people that they find in these 2 datasets that have at least 0-starred floor 12 of MoC. So I said in another video, this sample is not particularly representative of the player base of Honkai Star Rail as a whole. I would guess that probably the vast majority of players of Honkai Star Rail log in to play the story and collect the pretty pixels and, do dailies and stuff, but don't really care too much about the endgame content. But I think that the Pridewin statistics are probably pretty representative of people who care about completing MoC. And I think that's a pretty fair sample here. So how well are people who care about completing MoC doing at MoC? So we can see floor 10, probably not worth looking at. Floor 11 gets a little bit more interesting. See, we've changed the scale of the graph. It's going up to 10% here. And you can see, 2.2 again, a little bit harder. You see, about 3% of people were not 3-starring floor 11. Goes down to the, 2s and 1% down here. But floor 11 in 2.6, we can see, was, demonstrably harder than other versions. Up to over 5% of people were trying it in this data set didn't 3-star floor 11. And this was reflected in how people perceived this online. There were lots of people saying, well, floor 11 in this version is actually harder than floor 12. And the reason for that, and we'll get into a little bit more of this stuff later, was aventurine. Like, this, I think, was the first serious flaw of Memory of Chaos to contain aventurine. And aventurine has some very annoying mechanics that make him harder to clear in a certain amount of time. He has that dice mechanic that pauses the entire game, and if you don't have A, the luck, or B, the AoE skills on your characters, then you can get hit for a lot of damage, or I think you can even get crowd controlled for a while, and it actually makes defeating him in a small number of cycles pretty difficult. So, that was why 2.6 floor 11 was pretty hard. But, floors 10 and 11, people don't really use them as the yardstick for measuring the difficulty of Memory of Chaos, and we can see, pretty much stays about the same for the entire time. So let's have a look at floor 12. Floor 12, we've bumped up the scale again. It goes up to 20% at the bottom now, because the baseline that we can see here is that, for the most part, the people in this data set, somewhere between 90 and 95% of people in the data set are 3-starring floor 12. There's a little bit of an outlier in 2.7 where it gets a little bit above 10%. And again, 2.2, surprisingly hard. Almost 20% here didn't manage to 3-star floor 12. But again, we can see, looking at these statistics, even looking at floor 12, the hardest floor in MoC and the one that people tend to complain about the most, if we look at the data set of people who are serious about completing MoC, it seems remarkably consistent. Like, goes down, 2.2 is hard, 2.3 was easier, 2.4 was even easier, 2.5 was easier still, and then it kind of bumps up again to, back to in the same region. And so, just looking at the data in front of us of it, how people are actually completing MoC, it doesn't seem to be a great deal of evidence that it's getting harder. But this is only like one way of looking at the difficulty, and it's a very binary way, because if most people who care about this are still 3-starring it, a lot of the difficulty is in perception. And the way that you perceive the difficulty of MoC is not, did I get the thing that gives me the full number of rewards, which is just completing it in 3 stars. It's how many cycles did it take me to get there, which is really a measure of how comfortable it felt. Could I have just hit autoplay and walked away from this? Did I have to actually care a little bit? Did it feel stressful at the end because I was like getting closer and closer to that 10 cycle limit and going, oh god, am I going to get 2 stars on this or not? So that's kind of the perceived difficulty. So what I've done with that is, for each of the versions from 2.2 to 3.0, this is a graph of what percentage of people managed to complete it in how many cycles. And so we can see it's a pretty sort of common shape. There's a, it's harder to get a low cycle. A lot of people come in clutch near the end, and it's actually quite interesting that, a lot of people are like, okay, once I've got it in 10 cycles, okay, that's good enough. I'm not going to try and push any, not going to try and push any faster than that. I've got my rewards, and then I'm done. And You would expect, looking at this graph, you've got this big spike here, which is, obviously one version where very few people were getting it in the low cycles, starts to sort of kick up after 6, and a lot of people are just squeaking in at the end. And again, this isn't 3.0, it's 2.2. This is actually, again, looking at the graph, 2.2 was actually a bloody hard memory of chaos for a lot of people. Like, a lot of people were barely scraping in. And we can actually have this graph tell us a story of what happened after that. 2.2, tricky. A lot of people only just made it, and of the people who, it took more cycles, you can see there's a big outlier here for what happens at the greater than 10 cycle clear here. Like, there's a lot more people here who sort of did it in 11, 12 to 15. It's about the same number of people who was doing it in about 0 to 4 even, if you look at the sort of the area under the graph. So this was a difficult MoC, but we can see 2.3 after that suddenly got, significantly easier. There's much more people doing it in the low cycle count. You've got this more comfortable, flatter graph in the sort of the latter half of the cycle, more people doing it in 5, 6, 7, 8. And then 2.4 continues that trend, more people doing it early, and a nice sort of comfortable curve up here. And then 2.5 is the big outlier of the entire dataset. And I think this is where the perception of difficulty is coming from. Because if you actually look at the history of people complaining about quote-unquote power creep, which is a thing that exists and exists for a reason in the game, I might get to that in a bit, a lot of that starts in 2.6, because we got conditioned by going from this to this to this to this, that MoC, either MoC was getting easier or we were getting better at the game. And how gamers internalize things like that. It's like, yeah, cool, I'm really good at the game now. I can breeze my way through Memory of Chaos. This is a really satisfying experience. But, what was actually happening was just it was getting easier for everyone. And in 2.6, Hoyo made a correction. And they changed the difficulty of MoC, so it went back to, I think, this curve, which, if you look at how it fits with everything else on the graph, is kind of what they're going for. They want to make it hard to get this in really low cycles, but they want to make sure that people who care can get the full rewards, because making sure that people who care can get the full rewards is kind of how the game works. And so, we can see from there was a bit of a spike in 2.7, where 2.7 is starting to look surprisingly like a slightly easier version of 2.2, which is an interesting pattern if you think that both of these MoCs were the trotter mechanic. So maybe there's something about the trotter mechanic that makes people come in right at the end to clear it. I don't know. And then 3.0 drifting back again to this obviously intended difficulty curve. So, what was happening from 2.2 to 2.3 to 2.4 to 2.5 to create this progression? And it's pretty simple. What I did was I looked at the top 10 DPSs by appearance for each of those patches. So if we look at 2.2, 2.2 was Acheron's MoC, but it wasn't really Acheron's MoC, because I think Acheron came out in 2.1. 2.2 was kind of supposed to be Boot Hill's MoC. And it was probably designed for Boot Hill to shine, but the thing is, in terms of popularity of characters, Acheron had just come out, Firefly was just about to come out, Boot Hill was not pulled a great deal, did not appear a great deal, so possibly a big chunk of the difficulty in 2.2 was that the MoC was designed for a character that a lot of people didn't have, so a lot of people were brute forcing it with Acheron, or continuing through with Dot Team. Himiko is showing up here with a really high appearance rate, and it was probably not the most comfortable MoC for a lot of people. But then after 2.2, by 2.3, we have the Firefly Acheron combo, and these are the characters that the meta of the 2.x series of Honkai Star Rail were being designed around. So this is where things start getting a lot more comfortable, because these two were very popular characters that a lot of people pulled. Probably a lot of people pulled Eidolons for Firefly or Acheron, or maybe even both if they were whaling, and it kind of got pretty, and so this is where it starts getting comfortable. And then after 2.3, Fei Xiao enters the mix, and suddenly we've got our trifecta of the 2.x Memory of Chaos meta characters, all of which were, very popular amongst players, and players tended to have, at least, probably at least two of these three if, they were pulling at all strategically. Even if they were free to play, you get enough free tickets to, have got at least sort of two of these characters, because they were spread out pretty evenly between major patches. And then 2.5, which is where, that curve becomes the easiest. 2.5 was the Firefly Fei Xiao patch. I've put out an entire very long video going through kind of statistical analyses of different things about 2.5 MoC. I might link it down the bottom. But this was just the Firefly Fei Xiao patch, but the thing about it, and this is what I looked at in the analysis, is if you didn't have Firefly or Fei Xiao, then substituting in Acheron or Yunli or even Himiko did a pretty reasonable job of clearing it in, 6-ish cycles. And that's kind of what was responsible for 2.5 being the most comfortable patch. Everyone had been given March 7th for free, and she was performing really well. And again, this is where people started to feel, this is what MoC should feel like. I've finally become good at this game. I finally built my teams the way that they're going to be really good in MoC. And then, people continued with Firefly, Acheron, Fei Xiao, while maybe MoC was being tuned for characters like Rapper, who landed in this patch, who were not getting as many pulls because people were broke after pulling some of these. And 2.7 is surprising in that, the Herter, who didn't appear for the first, I think, at least 1 week of, or maybe half week, I'm not sure, of this MoC cycle, shows very strongly in these statistics, because again, the Herter, first really popular DPS drop since Fei Xiao. Lots of people were grabbing her because this is what the 3.0 meta was going to be, etc., and sort of making a big showing in 2.7. And then by 3.0, the Herder is dominating. Aglaya is starting to show up, and we're really sort of seeing the transition from the 2.x meta into what's the 3.x meta is going forward. This kind of takes us back to this graph. If we look at the actual performance of people who care about finishing MoC, as we've kind of established in our data set, over time, then aside from a couple of outliers like 2.2 and 2.5, it generally follows the same pattern in terms of people's actual performance in MoC. And that to me seems to suggest that while MoC is obviously getting harder in the sense that more enemies, more HP, and more demands on the teams that are placed into MoC, the teams that people are playing in MoC are good enough to meet that challenge. And you could imagine what would happen if Honkai Star Rail were designed differently, such that the difficulty of MoC never changed. What would happen? Well, new characters and old characters would be about the same power level, which is, this is the dreaded power creep would go away. But what would be lost would be, the incentive to get new characters, which is a thing that Hoyo is obviously interested in. But also, just as you play the game and you collect more characters and you continue to gear them up, you, in terms of just the general power level of your account, is always going up just that little bit every week. Like, you've collected a character that fills a particular hole in your roster, or, opens you up to, if they have this particular weakness, I can use this one now. Or you've just been continually farming gear, and the average gear level of your character has gone up. And so if the actual difficulty of Memory of Chaos stayed the same over time, then we would just see this continual slide of these graphs down as the average player base started to overpower the content. And that would actually make MoC a lot less interesting for most players, because you just reach this point where it's like, okay, my roster is good enough to do this now. Every time it comes out, I can just throw the same set of characters of the same kinds of challenges, and I'm done with it. And where is the interest in that? And we'd just kind of flatten out towards the situation we were in 2.5, where everyone, or sort of most players who were playing MoC, had the complement of 2.5 meta characters that worked on the content and were just kind of starting to breeze through it. And I think that very much Honkai Star Rail and Hoyoverse have an incentive, not only obviously to keep selling you new characters, but to keep pushing the power level in such a way as you can't reach that point where it's like, okay, now I've outgeared and outpulled all the content and I can stop caring, because once you stop caring, you stop playing. Anyway, that's enough from me today. I hope you found something to be angry about, and maybe I'll see you again for another one of these when another little piece of statistical nerdery happens to interest me.